Welcome to the second session of seafood canning technology. In this session, we will be dealing with the history of canning, particularly how this technology evolved over the years. Because canning technology as such has around more than 100 years of evolutionary history. So, in this session, we will be dealing with the different kinds of interventions, inventions, developments that happened during each stage of historical significance. So, in order to understand the history of a particular technology, we need to have an idea regarding what was actually happening before the invention of this technology. So, before that we had fewer options, even though the surplus production of seafood was there. So, there were not sufficient technologies available to continue or maintain the freshness of the seafood. As you know that seafood is a very perishable product and it is very difficult to maintain the quality for a longer period of time. So, in order to store the surplus production of seafood, at those period of time, the technologies we had was actually adopted from the natural scenarios or natural conditions, like drying, salting, smoking, and other pickling, that kind of methods. The products which were subjected to these processes at that particular period of time was not much of consumer demand. Because if you take an example of drying itself, so a dried fish, what happens is, as you know, we remove the moisture content of the fish. When we remove the moisture content of the fish, what happens is it brings out an array of changes to the food, particularly the fish muscle. Like when you are removing the moisture, the color of the fish may change, the biochemical composition may be changed, and even the texture of the fish changes, the smell, everything changes. So, from a pleasant form of seafood, sometimes if you are not careful enough for hygienically handling the fish during drying, it may lead to an unpleasant form of product. So, such preservation methods during that period, even though these methods were existing, these were not finely tuned or more hygienically standardized so that it will have a more consistent quality and consumer acceptability. So, it was not there at particular time. So, even the dried products were of not that much of demand. And also in the case of cured products, like curing, like salting, application of salting, drying and smoking were also practiced at that particular point of time. All the curing as such also had certain inacceptabilities among the consumer, like because smoking, as you know, impregnates the food with the phenolic components in the smoke, and particular it adds a particular flavor, smoky flavor to the fish. It alters the color of the fish, taste, everything. So, that also was some limited demand during that particular period of time. And also another method which was heavily in practice was that pickling processes. But pickling also, the process also alters the food, because it contains a high concentration of acid. It is an acidic product, pickled products. So, that also alters the taste, texture and complete consumption experience by the consumers. So, all these preservation techniques which were existing at that particular point of time lacked this kind of consumer acceptability. So, the industry actually demanded for new kind of preservation techniques which could overcome these limitations of these techniques. So, the major intervention happened regarding the invention of canning was during the period of Napoleon Bonaparte, which was he lived between 1761 to 1821. So, what happened was during his era, it was actually the pre-industrialization era. So, during that period of time, the world scenario was completely filled with war-like situations, like many countries were having war with each other. So, war or such kind of activities were of more importance, like handling the social scenarios or social situations at that particular period of time. Such kind of war-like aggressions were mostly common at that period of time. So, the issue with war is that it has to involve people, like soldiers was a major integral part at that particular period of time, and soldiers were very important to win a particular war. So, soldiers means people who need to travel away from normal inhabited area. They need to carry food with them, because there was a saying that an army marches on its stomachs. So, what it means is that if you are not feeding your army with healthy and nutritious food, so it is going to affect the performance of the cavalry. At that particular period of time, we cannot take food, because whatever food the army could take was either in the form of dry, dehydrated form, either in the form of smoked or cured form, and either in the form of pickled form. So, there was not much options available, and freezing also, the technology evolved much later. And but freezing, the issue is that we need costly machinery, and considerable amount of infrastructure is also required to maintain the quality of the frozen product. But that also is still in the war situations or the soldier scenario, frozen products are still not preferred. So in that particular period of time, Napoleon encountered such problems because scurvy was a common nutritional disease, very common with the soldiers at that particular period of time, especially the navy, the people who fought on the sea. Naval soldiers actually encountered much issues because they were far away from the land and in the sea for days, and because of the particular amount of food they could carry, within weeks the food will spoil and they cannot store it for a longer period of time. And the problem with consuming dehydrated, pickled or smoked food is that they are high in salt content. So you cannot consume it above a considerable quantity limit. So if you consume it in more quantities, that will create many other health conditions. So that was not preferred. So Napoleon addressed this issue. Then he found out that the performance of his soldiers were significantly affected by the non-availability of fresh food. He announced in 1795 around 12,000 francs and fame. That is the title of the reward that he announced. So one who will develop a technology which will enable his soldiers to carry fresh food or nutritious food without getting spoiled in the battlefield. So that was the announcement made by the Napoleon Bonaparte during 1795. So Napoleon actually triggered a series of invention efforts by a number of scientists and number of people at that particular period of time. The 12,000 francs was a very significant amount at that period of time. So many people started working on that challenge, and the person who first responded for that challenge, who came up with a significant solution for that challenge, was Nicolas Appert. He lived between 1749 and 1841. So Nicolas Appert is still considered as the father of canning technology, because he come up with a technique, but history of that technique is also very significant, because the concept of heating to preserve the food for a longer period of time, the concept or the practice was already there during the 14th and 15th centuries, because especially in China and Japan, the process of heating wine was practiced to enhance the shelf life or the keeping quality of wine. So even at that period of time, there was a knowledge among the human beings, or knowledge in the society, that the process of heating could actually extend the shelf life of a product. But they were not much knowledgeable regarding the actual process that is happening in that process. So what actually the heat is doing, that idea was not there, but that understanding was already present. And also during 17th century, many Italian scientists or Italian confectioners have worked on this aspect, and also some has proposed a concept of heating food in a container and sealing the container. So heating the food in a container and then after sealing the container, was that concept or that hypothesis was already present. But Nicolas Appert, what he did is that he took that hypothesis and he developed into a practically applicable method. He developed a technique in which he used glass jars, and whatever food need to be preserved, he heated in that particular glass jars. After heating, he made sure that the opening of the container is perfectly sealed. So he found out that if you heat something in a container, later if you seal it properly, and that particular food can be stored for a longer period of time. That was his invention. What Nicolas Appert did was that the technique was perfected in his laboratory, and he experimented with a number of foods by using this same process, like he was heating it in a container and sealing it, and he developed heating methods of around 50 different kinds of food products, and he published a book actually in 1811 after getting the reward. The technology was presented to Napoleon Bonaparte and he won the reward, and after that in 1810 he accomplished this, and in 1811 he brought out a book actually called as The Art of Preserving Animal and Vegetable Substances. That was the French meaning of the title of the book, and in that particular book he mentioned around 50 recipes how you should be doing this process, how heating and sealing of this containers needs to be practiced. And this book was very popular, and later it was translated in English and it was very popular in US also. The US version of this book was titled as The Book for All Households. So that was the title of the book when it was published in USA. So in this book contained elaborate techniques or processes which needs to be followed by while producing this product using his technology. And you can see that this is the actual container that is used by Nicholas Appert while doing his process. He used a wide mouth glass jar for his process, and normally he used normal cork for closing the container. Significance of his work, if you read the book, you will understand that he already knew the many of the basic principles that we practice regarding the canning technology, but he didn't knew the mechanism behind that processes, but all the concepts or all the basic principles he understood. So, for example, he mentioned that the fire has the peculiar property. The terminology that he used is that fire has a peculiar property not only for changing the combination of the constituent parts of vegetable and animal productions, but also of retarding for many years at least, if not of destroying, the natural tendency of those same productions to decomposition. So, this was the observations made by him, but the significant part is from this statement we need to understand is that fire has the peculiar property. So, he understood that the heating, the material that we are going to heat and the way we are going to heat or the fire that we are using, it has a peculiar property for imparting a certain characteristics to the food. So, he understood the importance of heating. That is one of the important points still we practice when we are standardizing canned products. So, another statement is that application of fire in a manner. So, he also knew the significance of application of heat, but he also understood the way the heat needs to be applied. So, any kind of heating will not give you the desired results. So, that is also understood in canning, that what kind of heating medium you should be using and what kind of heating, whether it should be a direct flame or indirect flame, direct heating, indirect heating. These concepts are now widely discussed when we are standardizing a product. But the interesting part is that when during the beginning of this technology, beginning of the intervention of this technology itself, Nicholas Appert understood the fact about this, how the fire needs to be applied. He is also mentioning that before I state the details of my process, I ought to observe that it consists principally. So, what are the principles he required? He wanted the people who follow his technology to observe when applying these techniques. So, he also mentions about enclosing in bottles the substances to be preserved. So, the heating is one important part and enclosing it in a bottle is also. So, the packaging part of the technology is also was well understood by Nicholas Appert. And also he talks about corking the bottles with the utmost care, and chiefly on the corking that the success of the process depends. So, he is stating that the success of the canning technology or success of the canning process depends on the properly closing the container. So, the closing the container lid at particular appropriate point of time and in an appropriate manner was very significant for the success of this process. So, this is still followed actually, the can closing process or the closing of the container process. Now, we use sophisticated techniques to close it successfully, so that we will get an airtight seal. But at that period of time, the only option available was for applying a cork in the opening of the container. But still he understood the fact that it was highly significant to close the container properly. And also another significant method he observed is that the use of water in a water bath. So, he did not use direct heating or direct flame. So, he heated water and the heat of the water was in turn used to heat the bottle. So, he basically used a water bath because greater or less length of time. So, that is another observation he made. So, he understood that for different food products, we need either a more heating time or lesser heating time. So, basically the time temperature, the concept of time temperature combination that we follow when we are applying canning technology in these times, it was understood by Nicholas Appert hundreds of years before when he invented the technique. So, all the basic principles which are still relevant to this technology was completely understood by Nicholas Appert, and he specifically mentions it in his book. So, that is also a very interesting point. And also finally, he makes sure that in withdrawing the bottles from the water bath at the periods prescribed. So, that also is mentioned by Nicholas Appert, because why this withdrawing of the bottles? Because the cooling stage. So, he understood that we need to remove the heat source from the bottle after it has been sufficiently cooked for a particular period of time, because if you do not remove the bottle, you will basically overcook the product. So, he understood that. So, removal of the withdrawing, he used the terminology like withdrawing the bottles from the water bath at the period prescribed. So, for each product there was a time period prescribed by him in which you need to remove the bottle from the heat source. So all the heating and cooling cycles, the time temperature combinations, the process, the importance of can closing or the bottle container closing was well understood by him, and he specifically explains the significance of all these processes in his book. When we proceed from Nicolas Appert, the next significant contribution is made by Peter Durand. During his lifetime, the period he lived was 1766 to 1822. The Peter Durand is a very significant name when we consider about the canning technology as such. When we consider Nicolas Appert the father of the canning technology, so we should consider Peter Durand as the father of industrial canning, because he revolutionized the industrial process of canning. Why means he got the first patent for the idea of preserving the food using a tin can. So he introduced the concept of applying the metal containers or tin coated steel containers which could be used for canning, because as you know, Nicolas Appert did all his experiments in glass bottles. So at this particular period of time, the glass bottles were very costly, the manufacture of glass bottles were also very costly, and still the glass containers are a premium kind of packaging products. So that time also it was very costly, and it is very difficult to handle, difficult to transport it, it was brittle. So a lot of issues were there with glass containers. So as Peter Durand introduced the metal containers of this canning, so he got the patent granted to him in 1810 itself by King George III of the England. He was granted the first UK patent for using metal containers for canning. So that was a very significant intervention. So later what Peter Durand did for popularizing his technology or popularizing his patent was that he sold patent to two gentlemen. One was Robert Ayres in USA during 1812, and another one was Brian Donkin of UK during 1812. These two gentlemen, what they did was the patent was purchased from Peter Durand, and they went to UK and USA and established their first industrial canning processes. So industrial canning factories in those places. So that is a very significant step. So the first industrial facility in UK and USA was created by Mr. Brian Donkin and Robert Ayres. So that is a very significant achievement when we consider the history of the canning. But the issue with the canning at that particular period of time is that we know that metal container can be used, but the issue with the tin coated steel containers was that it was all handmade at that particular period of time. Actually, the ironsmiths has to be working on making of the container, and only a few containers could be made in an hour, to one container, one or two containers per hour or something like that. So when it was tediously constructed by ironsmiths, so they need to cut the metal containers, they need to bend the sheets and make it into can shapes, and so that was a very tedious process. So a significant intervention happened in 1846 when Henry Evans, who developed prefabricated dies to increase the production speeds tenfold, because he invented prefabricated dies to cut the different parts of the container. So the issue was before the measurement it should be hand cut. We need to draw certain specific measurements over the metal sheet, and that needs to be specifically cut by hand by the ironsmith. But the Henry Evans, what he did was specific cutting dies he developed, so at a go they can immediately cut the required measured metal plates easily. So that actually accelerated the speed of the production of metal containers. And also in 1847, Alan Taylor patents a machine for stamping cylindrical cannons. So Henry Evans actually developed prefabricated metal dies for cutting the sheets. So Alan Taylor, what he did was that he patents a machine, or he invents a machine for stamping cylindrical can ends. The ends of the can needs to be stamped so that the lids needs to be fitted perfectly. That was also a very tedious process. So he improved that process. Also in 1849, Henry Evans is granted the patent for the pendulum press. Another significant is pendulum press, which combined with a die device makes a can end and in a single operation. So he developed a pendulum press because the cans could be easily stamped from metal sheets. So this invention by Henry Evans and Alan Taylor, and further by Henry Evans in 1849, all this what did was accelerated the container making process. That significantly affected the industrial way. Because of the stamping machine or pendulum press, actually the production rate of canning was around 5 to 6 cans per hour during that period of time. By the invention of Henry Evans, the production increased up to 50 to 60 per hour. So, for information, now the can making process is around 2000 cans per minute. So, just imagine that up to that level now the technology is developed. Now the production capacity is around 2000 cans per minute, but at that particular period of time it was only 5 to 6 cans per hour. So, then it increased to 50 to 60 per hour, and then further as the technology improved, the number of cans produced during a particular period of time increased. Another significant issue, the containers at that particular point of time was the difficulty to open that container. Since the metal containers were used at that particular point of time, we need to use different kinds of tools for opening the container, like a hammer or a chisel or something like that. So it was a very laborious process at that particular point. So the major invention in this direction was made by Ezra J. Warner in 1858 in US. So what he did was he patents the first can opener. So he invented the first can opener which could be easily used by the consumer to open the metal container. So this was heavily used by US military during the Civil War at that particular period during the 1858. And also, other than can opener, there was a significant intervention in 1858 which was done by John L. Mason. So he patents the Mason's jar. So Mason's jar is a significant intervention because during that period of time, the glass containers, as I told, that the only way to close the glass container was using by cork, the corking process. So it was very unhygienic and it was a very difficult process and difficult to open further after corking. John L. Mason did was that how to fit a screw cap on a glass container. So he made specific grooves to the opening of the glass container, and to which a metal or any other form of lid can be rotated and fitted into that place. So the screw cap was introduced into the glass container by John L. Mason. So that actually revolutionized the home canning industry or home canning process. So the normal consumers could buy this kind of mason jars, further use it for home canning purposes. So that was a very significant intervention. Thank you.